Alright, Monday's here. I'm running a little bit late today. I had a bunch of other things I had to do. But this is a little bit of transmission problem stuff that we're looking at. This first story I'm going to tell you is one that I borrowed from Ernie Gazla, Victor Transmission, and Wayne Kalana. Wayne Kalana is probably one of the foremost transmission experts that I know of, in the circles that I travel in. I'm going to jump into this thing and show you what we had. We're going to get a grip on what the symptom is to start with. If somebody is just telling you that their transmission's not quite working right, you basically need to know what it is they're talking about exactly so you can identify it, because to them it may not feel, they may not even know how to describe it exactly. But this one here, you're going to check the fluid, look for obvious problems, damage, leaks, this kind of thing. You also need to make sure that whenever you're using your Perndl stick, that it's actually putting the transmission in the ranges that the indicator tells you it is. Something else I would say about transmissions too, when you're we put a transmission back in a Chevy S10 Blazer one time, and when we got it put back in there, we were actually replacing it with a salvage unit or something, I can't remember, but the point is, we popped the transmission back in it, and we noticed that even though the shift cable was adjusted as far as it could be adjusted, this thing, you could not say for sure it was in park. I think I may have mentioned it in these videos before, but on that particular one, when we put it in park, you could put it in park and it may be in park and it might jump out of park, and that was a problem, and I couldn't adjust the cable to make it do any better. On that particular one, I had another transmission sitting over there that I'd had for a while, and I went and took the little shift link off of that one, which was exactly like the one that was on the transmission that was in the truck, and I put that one on there, and they looked the same and everything. But after I put that shift link with the little double D on it, that went on the shift rail, I put that on there, and it went in park every single time. Now occasionally you'll need to replace the cable or something like that, but it's not a good idea to ever let a transmission go out of there if you're not sure that that thing's going to stay in park. It may work right every other way that it needs to work, but if it won't go in park and stay there, you're going to kill somebody, so be really, really careful about that. This one here was a 2002 Tacoma that Ernie and Wayne were talking about. Intermittent, no reverse, takes off in second gear, no shift to fourth, and an intermittently stored code, the P0755, for the S2 S2 shift solenoid performance. The code was recorded and then cleared and did not return even when the reverse and second gear started, no fourth gear occurred during road test. Now what this means to me when I see solenoid performance, it basically means that the engine, that the controller, whatever the controller is, with the ECM or the TCM or the PCM or whatever it's operating at, it saw that electrically the solenoid was working, but it detected that the condition the solenoid was trying to control wasn't happening. That's what that performance code has always flagged for me. May not be the same on every make, but that's what I always think of when I see that. The Shift 2 solenoid was replaced, and they noticed that the pan was clean. The solenoid don't look like much, and typically what the solenoid does is it stops the fluid passage, stops fluid flow, keeps it from venting, so that it will move from valves and make things happen. They road tested it, but it still had an intermittent no reverse starting off in second gear. The absence of fourth gear wasn't fixed. Complete valve body assembly with different OE solenoids was also tried. That didn't fix it either. Well, they checked the voltage on the wires for the S1 and S2 solenoid and verified scan data and proper shift solenoid command. So, in idle and park, neutral, reverse, the S1 solenoid, which is the violet wire, it always showed 0 volts. Now, see what happens is these are grounded, and this ECU is actually sending out power to these solenoids. And we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. That's an Asian thing. Asians like to do theirs like that and all that. But the light green wire always showed 0 volts. That one right there, this one. Alright, so the problem occurred. They noticed there was 2 volts showing on this wire right here when it should have been off. 0 volts. Okay, so as a test, the S2 wire was cut. We cut this wire right here, reverse engaged immediately, and it allowed for first gear takeoff. Unfortunately, the same problem remained after, with 2-volt phantom showing up again. It was determined the computer must have a bad driver. So the shop bit the bullet and bought a new controller. Excuse me, that's the controller, that's the valve body. Still not fixed. Thinking there was a short in the power somewhere in the circuit, they ran an overlay, which covered it with another wire, and from the solenoid to the ECU connector. But what they found was this ground was a little bit loose, and it was dancing around down there. And the funny thing about that was the customer said the problem didn't show up until after having engine work done in another garage. They might have saved themselves a lot of time and money if they'd have said that to start with. If they'd have said engine work was done and then after that it wouldn't shift right. See, that way they're kind of known to go looking for grounds and stuff like that. Typically, any time when you see a ghost voltage somewhere when there's not supposed to be any, that'll be a ground-related problem. One example of that is if, for example, on some of the old O2 circuits on the Fords, if you saw that if the ground wire for that, the orange wire was supposed to go to ground the O2 sensor circuit. If that orange O2 sensor ground was disconnected, you might see 2.5 volts on the O2 sensor signal wire, which would indicate that you needed to go be checking grounds and all that. Anyway, here's one right here. This was one that I was involved with. This was at the dealership where that I was working, and I don't know how many of you ever saw it, but the Mopar Diagnostic system was Chrysler's answer to the Ford Service Bay Diagnostic System. It was a box with a 286 processor in it and a screen on top of it, basically like a roll around cart that looked like a computer. The funny thing about this Mopar Diagnostic System was it had a telephone receiver on the back of it, and it had a really, really, really loud ringer that would ring loud enough to where you could hear it all over the shop, even if you had engines running nearby and all that. And that thing, I had wired up the phone line to it because that was some of the stuff they typically had me do at the dealership. If they needed a phone wire run, they'd have me to do it because it was cheaper to have me do it than it was to call the phone company. But anyway, I had run that phone line, so I knew the number phone number that was connected to that Mopar Diagnostic System. And my buddy Donnie was dating this girl that worked at the credit union at the time. And I was leaving town to drive to Savannah, early that Friday. And it was before the days of cell phones and all. And I went down there and I said, I was getting some money out of the bank for my trip to Savannah. And the girl that Donnie was dating says, how do I get a hold of him down at the dealership? And I said, well, if you'll call this number right here, then that big loud phone ringer will ring on the back of that Mopar Diagnostic System. And he works right over there close to it, right there close to where I work, and he'll answer that phone if you do that. And that phone was loud. I go, la 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 la. You could hear it everywhere. I mean, it was really loud. So I says, here's a funny little thing. Why don't you call him and tell him that you're going to audit his taxes? And so, we laughed about that a little bit. And so she took the phone number I gave her to call him. And so when I headed out for Savannah, I came back Monday, and he was really a little disgruntled with me because he says, she put her friend on the phone so I wouldn't recognize her voice. That phone rang, I picked it up, and here's this woman's voice that tells me she's from the IRS and she's going to audit my taxes. And my heart literally stopped for a second and skipped a couple of beats. And I said, well, didn't you think it was odd they were calling you on the MDS machine and knew who you were and that you would answer it? I guess he thought it was like person of interest, with that machine. He says, I'm not worried about any of that. All I was hearing about was I was going to get an IRS audit, and it scared the crap out of me. Anyway, boy, I really went off on a tangent there, didn't I? Customer said he'd buy this truck if we could fix it that day. It was hunting in and out of fourth gear, driving at highway speeds. It was a diesel. It would go in, out, in, out, in, and out of fourth. So the salesman rushed it over to a transmission shop where they got some of their work done. When our transmission folks were swamped, the transmission shop said it put a TP sensor on it. The salesman brought it to me with a TP sensor that didn't fit. I did a search on the MDS and found out a reflash had been written to fix the fourth gear hunt on that particular truck. And so I went ahead and did that reflash, and it fixed that thing. Even though the throttle position sensor didn't fit, I had to put it on there. But after that, the guy drove the truck and he bought it because it was fixed. And the salesman brought me back a gift certificate to Longhorn Steakhouse so that I could eat a steak, which was pretty cool, you know, and it makes you look like a superhero whenever you do something real simple like that. It's always a good idea to see if there's any reflashes that address what it is you're talking about. Granted, it was pretty easy because I had that, you know, that vehicle hooked up to the machine by way of the DRB3 and all that kind of thing. Now, this is another one right here. This 94 Escort was totally screwed up. As far as the shifting went, it didn't do anything right shifting. It was taking off in the wrong gear. It wouldn't shift. It was just doing crazy things. And the transmission mechanic had rebuilt the darn thing, and he actually couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. And so I built this little box right here, and I got some LEDs. Now you got to put a 50 ohm resistor in line. You know, the long lead on these LEDs is positive, and the short lead is negative. And it doesn't matter which leg you put the resistor in, but if you don't put a resistor in line with that LED, it'll burn out the LED. All right, but I put 4 LEDs, and I had 4 little 50 ohm resistors. They didn't cost much. Bought all of it from Radio Shack, a little project box. And this one right here, we had these marked, and we knew exactly where we were going to hook each one of these up. Power and ground coming in. You can imagine what the inside of the box was wired like. Wasn't a big deal. So that whenever, and this Asian transmission was actually putting voltage out to the solenoids like that Toyota was. And I took this chart right here, and I made a little, you know, we figured out what the pattern of these lights was supposed to be like. Like in reverse, when I've got an orange one, that means it could be off or on. If I got a red one, it's on. If it's a black one, it's always off. So it could be on or it could be off, and that would still be okay. It's really important to differentiate that. You might even notice up here it's like that in the chart. Okay, and D2, you got all 3 of these on and that one off. And see, you might think, you know, I used to think when I first started seeing these shift solenoids 1, 2, and 3, that it would turn on solenoid 1 when it was in first gear, solenoid 2 when it was second gear, and shift solenoid 3 when it was in third gear. That ain't the way it is. They're all over the map. And if you don't know how that thing, that's why they got this chart right here. I don't know who came up with all of that stuff. But probe, back I had run into a probe. For the probe, they gave us a special tool that had a similar function to this, but it had connectors that were just, you know, it was like a breakout tool that would go in there between the harness and the transaxle. And that darn thing would have lights like that, and they were marked and all that. The only problem was, if you didn't know what the pattern was on those lights and how they were supposed to look, you'd get confused really, really, really fast. And I made a little cheat sheet so that the transmission mechanic, or me if I happen to be the one working on it, could actually look at that pattern of lights and tell if that thing was working right. But when we used that little box I built on that Escort, we found out real quick that that engine controller wasn't doing anything like it was supposed to be. And when he put the PCM on there, it took care of everything, every problem that transmission had. That's all that was wrong with it to start with. But if you're like me, you've seen a lot of times when people changed the black box and it didn't fix it. Now they spent that money, and typically the parts department doesn't want it back anyway. Well, P07XX codes, it can be a P1 or a PO, whatever. That's transmission related codes. If the check engine light doesn't come on but you've got shifting problems, there may be electrical or mechanical problem of some kind related to the solenoids. This is really important to know how these solenoids operate. You might recognize all of these on that GM transmission there. Every automatic transmission's got some kind of pressure control, whether it's mechanical, is it a modulator valve, or a throttle valve cable, or electromagnetic. Most transmissions will default to high pressure when a problem is detected, because that's the safest thing to do. It applies the clutches real solid so they don't slip, because it doesn't take much slipping to wipe the lining off these silly little things. The clutches apply harder when the pressure is high. That doesn't hurt anything. It prevents them from slipping unless they're already burned out. Now Chrysler stayed away from modulator valves, as most people know that's worked on the old Chrysler train. The old 727 torque flat and the 904 and all. But this one time I had that 67 Chrysler that I drove, was a black one, and I had rebuilt the engine in it. But when I put it back in there, I didn't put this, the little slotted throttle valve link that goes down to the transmission. I didn't put a spring on it to keep it pulled forward, and it was laying way back all the time. We had the pressure really high, and every time it shifted, it would go boom, it would hit really hard. Well, that wasn't really hurting anything, but you swear it was going to tear something up. But anyway, when you're deeper into the throttle, the pressure needs to go up because it needs to hold the gears longer, and it also needs to shift with more force. When doing the work in the throttle body area, though, don't forget to reconnect the throttle valve linkage cable. If you leave that thing unhooked and somebody goes driving it with that thing disconnected, the pressure is always going to be low. Because see, when you apply the throttle, it pulls it out, and there's also adjustment there for that and all. But anyway, if that thing is unhooked, it will burn the transmission up, because that low pressure, when they're getting on it, will cause them clutches to slip. I've seen that happen. Ford had a recall back in the late 80s, as I remember. I think it was the late 80s on the Crown Victorias and the Grand Marquis. They had a funky little bushing that we had to put in there on the shift linkage, so that it was a bronze bushing with a little hairpin clip to replace what was there, which I think it was something that was plastic and kept failing and coming out of there. And so the deal with that was, if the transmission was burned up because that thing had popped out of there before anybody had done the recall. It wasn't a recall, it was a sort of it was a program, that expired with time and mileage, whatever they call that, a campaign. Anyway, the long and the short of it was, people would come in with their for that thing, and if their transmission was burned up because that thing had popped out of there, then Ford would, replace or rebuild the transmission. Any cable that's extended as the throttle is applied is a transmission throttle valve cable typically. The cruise control cable will be operating tandem to the throttle cable if it's got cables on it. Domestic transmission solenoids are typically ground actuated. Asian transmission solenoids are positive side switch. That means the hardwired side of the solenoid on domestic transmissions is always hot, and the PCM grounds the solenoid to make it work. Like that right there. See, there's your solenoid. You notice you got a red wire, a hot wire going to the back side of those. That's a domestic transmission right there. As a matter of fact, this is a General Motors 4L60E, I think. All right, Asian transmissions are hardwired to ground, and the PCM applies power to make them work. They're hardwired to ground, power comes in this way. Now, the only time, the 4EAT transmission was a Mazda transmission, the one that was in that Escort I was talking about earlier, and it was wired up this way because it was at its heart an Asian transmission. Something else that Ford did this way was electronic suspension solenoids were hardwired to ground, and the controller would feed power to them. And so one time I had borrowed that box. I built that transmission mechanic to check some solenoids that were for suspension on a Lincoln or something. Anyway, the planetary gears provide the gear ratios depending on what's held and what's driven. That's just the way it is. This right here was part of the 4L60. It reacts in sunshine. It likes to break right there. You might have seen a bunch of those, and it causes reverse and fourth gear issues, if I remember right. Solenoid packs. Their solenoids will be in a single pack for a Dodge Stratus on some of them. This is really cool. I had seen that one Dodge Caravan that I may have mentioned that earlier. I can't remember. That had water in the fluid, and somebody at the transmission shop told her it had water in the fluid. So the lady that worked at the college, she brought it over, and I pulled the dipstick. Sure enough, it was water in the fluid. It did not have a cooler in the radiator. The transmission cooler was outside the radiator. And so they must have gone through something deep stream or something and got some water in the transmission. And so I says, well, I'll tell you what, let's just go ahead and throw a solenoid pack on it after we do a full fluid exchange and just see what that does. Because you don't have anything to lose really anyway, except I told her, I said, this may fix it, it may not. And so she bought the fluid, and we did a full fluid exchange with all the fluid. Now when I'm doing a full fluid exchange, if it holds, like for example, if it holds 10 quarts, I'm just pulling that number out of here, I'll usually get like 15 quarts, and I'll run 10 quarts through there, and then I'll change the fluid and change the filter in the pan after doing the full fluid exchange. So I can make sure that everything's clean all the way through, and it's got a new filter and all. Well, that solenoid pack doesn't usually cost. So you can buy this right here, if you go to the right place, you can buy brand new on eBay, both of these speed sensors and the gasket and that, all this stuff. Tune that transmission up by replacing it. You gotta make sure you get the right one. That's for a Dodge Stratus right there. You can tune one of those up that way. Anyway, when we did that fluid exchange and replaced this on that van, took care of it completely. She drove it for months, never had another problem. I never heard from her again on a transmission. Well, I mentioned that in a Motor Age magazine article, and some expert on these transmissions really combed my ears down with an ugly email and told me that if that thing even had a teaspoon of water in the transmission, the whole thing should have been rebuilt. But if she was driving it and not having trouble with it, and all she paid for was a fluid exchange and the solenoid pack, I don't know what the problem was. All right. 4D, 4OD, and 4R100s have internal solenoids, those things right there. My Explorer a while back took a spell where when you would put it in reverse, it would sit there for a second and then it would engage real harsh. And there's a friend of mine over here that writes all kinds of tunes and stuff for, I mean, he can tune anything. He tunes diesels, he can, write tune to get rid of your passive anti-theft system. There's nothing this guy doesn't know, but they do regular work in the shop too. And I called him and I said, I know you've probably seen this because an Explorer didn't have a 70,000 miles on it. And I couldn't see it need any major transmission work, because I hadn't driven it hard. My wife never drove it hard when it was hers. He said, yeah, we've seen that. We need to put a solenoid pack on it and do a reflash, And so when he did that, it's just perfect every time now. And so, but that guy right there is a guru when it comes to writing tunes and programs and stuff. He's really good at what he does. 4L60E, there's your internal solenoid. There's your little tune-up kit for all of that. This has got your transmission oil temperature sensor in it, and you got your solenoids. And that right there, that whole wire frame right there, Ford's got the on their newer transmissions that they got these lead frames, they call them, that actually have the transmission controller built into them. And on 2009 models, you can change you got to change the whole valve body, but by the time they got to 2012, I think you could change just the lead frame. But that's another story right there. But we ran into a problem putting just a lead frame on one that was too early of a year model, and it would even talk, to the scan tool after we did that. So we went up and put the whole valve body on it. 4L60E wiring looks like this right here. That's not a big deal, fairly common. You're going to see there's all those solenoids there, and each one of them, you notice, is driven from the ground when they're diffused right there. One time, this girl that was in my program that was driving a '94 Pontiac Grand Am, she called and she says, something's wrong with my transmission, so I'm going to be late to class today. And I said, what's going on with your transmission? She says, well, when I put it in drive, it's like it's trying to take off in high gear. And she said, me and my dad are looking at it, and I said, check the fuses. And so after about 30 minutes, maybe 45, she showed up. And I says, well, what's going on? She goes, I checked the fuses. She said, initially when you told me to check the fuses, my dad said you were stupid and you don't ever worry with fuses when you're working on a transmission. But whenever I found that blown fuse and I replaced it, the transmission worked normally. And she said, so I learned something today. Jeeps are like that. This guy came in one time on this Jeep Cherokee, and he pulled in there and he said, I've rebuilt this. It was one of those 87 to 90 models. He said, I've rebuilt this transmission and I've been working on it for 6 weeks. I can't figure out why it won't shift. It'll shift. I can shift through the gears normally if I go, manually shift it, but he said it won't shift on its own. And so I reached under the dash right there by the glove box and pulled that wire harness down. A little 10-ounce fuse there feeding the transmission control unit was blown. Put another fuse in there and it shifted out perfectly. Anyway, he says, I won't buy you a case of beer. And I said, well, I don't drink, but what you can do for me is you can take this little Gideon Bible here and read Romans 10, 9, and 10. He said, well, I'll have my pastor pray for you. I thought that was funny. Anyway, Honda Odyssey transmissions got external solenoids. One time, I had my students pull a transmission out of a Honda Odyssey, and they sent it off. I sent it over to have it rebuilt at a transmission shop that was a specialist on those, but we didn't have time to rebuild it in that semester, too close to the end of the term. And when they brought that thing back, it didn't work right. But I knew that was a good transmission shop. I knew they had built it right. But what they had done was they had installed the way that the one they were put on that transmission, you could put these things in either way. And they put this one in that spot and that one in that spot. Now this one here is all made together, so you can't do that. But the one that we had worked on, the solenoids were standalones. And the brown one and the black one had been transposed. That's why those connectors are color-coded, so you won't plug them in backwards. When we put the transmission solenoids back where they were supposed to be and plugged them in, the transmission was perfect. That's pretty scary to start with, though, because pulling the transmission out of a Honda Odyssey is not for the faint-hearted, nor is putting it back. Alright, so solenoids can be numerous and complicated, like on this 2008 F-250 diesel. I got these internal solenoids. It's a real booger bear, and this is giving you all the specs for those, you know, the ohmage. Of course, if you notice, they're all the same anyway. And there's your electronic pressure control solenoid. And that electronic pressure control solenoid, when you disconnect the power from it, it typically jacks the pressure up, like I was talking about earlier. Because if it doesn't have any idea of what it's supposed to do, it defaults to high pressure most of the time. That's typically how they do. Alright, so there's your forward focus. You know, that's what one of those look like. There's your little shift chart up there. It's really important that you know that and how that's supposed to work. A lot of times you can plug a scan tool in and see what those solenoids are doing if you want to do it that way. Alright, and there's your solenoid applied chart like I was just talking about up there. That's what I use to build that. But like I say, most of them nowadays you plug a scan tool in, it'll tell you what it's doing with those solenoids. There's your clutch and your band application chart. That's really important too. Like if you're having some kind of a problem in, you know, in a gear like the fourth gear, you want to make sure, you know, if you've got a problem in two particular gears, like if you got a problem in second and fourth, but everything else is working right, you might say, well, these right here may be where my trouble is because that's applied in second and fourth. You see, but it's all the rest of them. If it's off, and all the rest of them are working right, but it's, you know, if these right here are not applying, like if you look at that 2-4 band, and that's basically how you would use that. Most of you guys know that. Some manufacturers will go out of their way in a big way to help. The others will throw you under the bus, but transmission gurus have apps you can download on your smartphone to help. Alright, that was basically the little rundown I wanted to give you on that. We don't usually talk a lot about transmissions on here. I got quite a few stories about, you know, the first transmission I ever rebuilt was a 727 torque flat in a Dodge truck back in the late 70s. And there was some other guy that had done transmissions that was hanging around there, and he couldn't keep his hands off what I was doing. And so I pulled that transmission down and, you know, laid everything out on the bench just like it was supposed to be. And when I put it all back together, it did just fine until it warmed up, and then it wouldn't apply in one of the gears. And it turned out that that knothead that couldn't keep his hands off my stuff came by there, and he pulled the inner seal off of one of the pistons when I wasn't looking. And I remember over my shoulder him saying something about, wow, this seal here is shot. And then he threw it aside because I didn't take it out. I didn't think to put it back, which was kind of dumb. I mean, I should have known this. But at the time, I didn't have any training on transmissions anyway. You know, I was just winging it. I rebuilt a transmission on a Clark forklift. That was a real happy job, you know, but that's a whole other story. The other thing that I would do occasionally, I mean, transmission fluid exchanges. My president of my college, his wife drove a 2004 Mercedes, don't remember the numbers, you know, 230, whatever, anyway. And he was telling me when he bought it for her that it had lifetime transmission fluid in it. And then after he'd been driving it a year or so, or she'd been driving it a year or so, he came back and said, this thing's not shifting right. And I said, well, let me figure out, give me the right fluid for it, and I'll do a full fluid exchange. And I built some adapters and did a fluid exchange and fixed that one. There was another lady that came in an '05 Cadillac, one of those crossovers, and the transmission fluid in that one looked like brake fluid. I mean, it was black, and it was thin, and it just did not look like transmission fluid. And so I did they wasn't shifting right either. And I did a full fluid exchange on that one, and it's completely took care of all the transmission problems they were having. A lot of the times it's something simple. Now, I did a whole other presentation about transmissions without dipsticks. I know some of you guys have run into that. There's a lot of people that are fussing and cussing on the internet about transmissions that don't have dipsticks and how stupid that is. But there's quite a few of them out there, and it's a good idea to know how to check that. Anyway, that winds up my presentation for today, and I really appreciate you guys watching.